In 1943, if you were a Canadian bomber pilot standing on an airfield with your two best friends, the statistics had already decided your fate. Only one of you was coming home. This wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a lottery, a death lottery rigged by physics, geography, and ruthless mathematics. The survival rate for a bomber crew member in the RAF Bomber Command was 44%. To put that into perspective, a soldier in the trenches of World War I had a statistically better chance of surviving the war than a Canadian boy flying over Germany at night. But for the recruits of the RCAF No. 6 group, the odds were even worse. They were young, they were inexperienced, and they were handed a contract that virtually guaranteed their destruction. It was called the Tour. On paper, it sounded manageable. 30 missions to complete a cycle of duty. Do 30 nights over hell, and you get a break. But the recruitment officers didn't explain the math behind the contract. If the average loss rate per mission is just 5%, mathematically, a crew is statistically dead by mission number 20. Most men were doomed to die before they even completed their first tour. And if you survived? If you somehow beat the odds, dodged the flak, and outmaneuvered the night fighters for 30 nights? Canada asked you to do it again. A second tour. 60 missions total. This was the 60-night rule. By the time a pilot signed up for that second tour, his statistical chance of survival wasn't 44%. It was less than 15. It was a death sentence disguised as a duty roster. To truly understand this tragedy, you have to look past the numbers and look at the faces of the men flying these planes. They weren't hardened soldiers. They weren't career military men with years of tactical experience. They were children. They were delivery boys from Toronto, farmhands from Saskatchewan, and fresh-faced students from McGill. The vast majority of the Royal Canadian Air Force crews were between 19 and 21 years old. Many had lied about their age just to get into a uniform. The propaganda posters promised them glory. They promised the Knights of the Air lifestyle, clean blue uniforms, warm beds, and the admiration of the public. It was sold as the ultimate adventure for a generation that had grown up in the poverty and stagnation of the Great Depression. They were trained in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, learning to fly in the vast, safe skies of the Canadian prairies. There, the skies were blue, the air was calm, and no one was shooting at them. It was an illusion of control that would shatter the moment they arrived in England. Nothing in their training could prepare them for the visceral reality of a Lancaster bomber at 20,000 feet over Europe. These boys were handed the keys to a 28-ton aluminum beast loaded with 2,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and 14,000 pounds of high explosives. Inside, the aircraft was not the glorious machine depicted in the newsreels. It was a torture chamber. The Lancaster was unpressurized and unheated. At operational altitude, the temperature inside the fuselage dropped to -40 degrees. The cold was a physical enemy. If a pilot or gunner touched the metal fuselage with bare skin, it would rip the flesh off instantly, like a burn. They flew wrapped in layers of bulky wool and electrified flying suits that often failed, leaving them freezing in the dark. It was a world of sensory overload. You couldn't talk to the friend sitting next to you because of the deafening, bone-shaking roar of 4 Merlin engines screaming just feet away. They were isolated, trapped in a metal coffin, communicating only through an intercom, breathing thin oxygen through a rubber mask that smelled perpetually of sweat, rubber, and fear. Before their first mission, veteran crews would often give the rookies a grim piece of advice. Tonight isn't a battle. Tonight is just you realizing that you have 59 more times to flip a coin against death. But why did the Canadians suffer so heavily compared to their British or Australian counterparts? Was it simply bad luck? The answer lies in geography and politics. When the RCAF formed the specialized No. 6 group, they were stationed in Yorkshire, far to the north of England. This administrative decision, seemingly minor on a map, had deadly consequences in the air. Being stationed in the north meant that Canadian crews had to fly significantly longer distances to reach the same targets in Germany as the British squadrons stationed in the south. Longer flight times meant higher fuel consumption. More fuel meant a heavier plane, a slower climb rate, and less room for error. But critically, it meant more time over the North Sea. The North Sea is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The weather fronts that smashed into the bomber formations often hit the Canadians first and hardest. They faced engine icing that could stall a plane in seconds. They battled navigation errors caused by violent storms. They dealt with blinding fog that made landing a fuel-starved bomber a suicide mission in itself. Many Canadian crews never even saw a German fighter. The weather killed them before they even crossed the enemy coast. But the weather was just the opening act. The targets were the main event. The RCAF was rarely sent on milk runs, the easy, low-risk missions. They were frequently assigned to hit the hard targets: Hamburg, Berlin, Essen, and the most feared name of all, the Ruhr Valley. The pilots had a different name for the Ruhr. They called it the Black Pit of Europe. Entering the Ruhr was like flying into the mouth of an active volcano. The German military defended this industrial heartland with over 20,000 anti-aircraft guns and vast belts of searchlights capable of blinding a pilot from miles away. For the young Canadians, tasked with flying these heavy, slow-moving giants straight into the pit, courage was often irrelevant. In the pitch black of night, surrounded by exploding flak, unable to see the plane flying just 5 feet off your wingtip, the horrifying realization set in. The darkness wasn't hiding them. The darkness was hunting them. The fundamental premise of the night bombing campaign was concealment. The logic was simple. If you fly under the cover of darkness, the enemy cannot see you. But by 1943, this logic had become a fatal misconception. The night did not protect the Canadian crews, it blinded them. While the bombers stumbled through the dark, relying on primitive navigation, the Germans were watching them with electronic eyes. The technological mismatch was catastrophic. The German air defense network had deployed the advanced Würzburg and Liechtenstein radar systems, which effectively turned the dark skies over Germany into a well-lit stage. To the radar operators on the ground, a stream of hundreds of bombers wasn't invisible. It was a glowing river of targets. The pilots believed they were hidden in the void, but in reality, they were flying directly into a trap that had been mathematically calibrated to destroy them. This is where the concept of statistical suicide becomes terrifyingly clear. When you analyze the 60-night rule through the lens of probability, the cruelty of the assignment is exposed. The math is cold and unforgiving. On any given night, a crew faced a roughly 3% chance of being shot down. That number sounds survivable in isolation, but probability is cumulative. When you compound that risk over a required 60 missions, 2 full tours of duty, the equation collapses. The survival rate plummets to less than 16%. For a young Canadian pilot, every successful return wasn't a step toward safety, it was simply a step closer to the inevitable statistical correction. The command was essentially asking these men to play Russian roulette 60 times in a row and expecting them to win every single trigger pull. So what exactly was killing them? If we break down the data, we see a horrifying hierarchy of destruction. The leading killer, responsible for nearly 40% of all bomber losses, was flak. The German anti-aircraft defenses were staggering in their density. In the Ruhr Valley alone, over 20,000 heavy guns were pointed at the sky. But the terror of flak wasn't about direct hits. The shells were fused to detonate at specific altitudes, creating a cubic box of lethal shrapnel that the bombers had to fly through. Pilots described the sound of shrapnel hitting the fuselage as gravel being thrown on a tin roof. It was a game of chance where skill meant nothing. You simply held your course, kept the wings level, and prayed that the next metal shard didn't tear through the fuel tank or the cockpit. The second killer, accounting for roughly 30% of casualties, was the Luftwaffe's Nachtjagd, the night fighter force. This was a more personal and terrifying form of death. German pilots flying Bf-110s and Ju-88s were equipped with nose-mounted radar that allowed them to stalk the bomber streams unseen. They developed a tactic known as Schräge Musik, jazz music. They would approach a Lancaster from below, climbing into the bomber's blind spot where no gunner could see them. Using upward-firing cannons, they would tear into the bomber's belly and fuel tanks. The crew would never know they were under attack until the aircraft exploded. For thousands of Canadian airmen, their war ended in a flash of fire without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. But the enemy wasn't the only threat. The chaos of the night itself claimed another 10 to 15%. Flying in tight formations of hundreds of aircraft, in pitch blackness with radio silence, led to inevitable disasters. Mid-air collisions were common. A moment of distraction, a slight drift in heading, and two bombers would slam into each other, disintegrating instantly. There were also the frantic moments of friendly fire, where nervous gunners would open fire on their own squad mates, mistaking the shadow of a Halifax for a German fighter. Finally, there was the machinery itself. The intense strain of long-range operations over the North Sea caused mechanical failures that accounted for another 10% of losses. An engine fire over the ocean, a hydraulic failure upon landing, or simply running out of fuel while searching for a fog-shrouded runway. These were the unglamorous, silent deaths that didn't make the headlines. This relentless, nightly exposure to death created a psychological environment that is hard for the modern mind to comprehend. This was the psychological death spiral. Unlike infantry soldiers who might stay on the front lines for weeks but then rotate out, the bomber crews lived a schizophrenic existence. They would face sheer terror for 8 hours over Berlin, watching their friends burn in the sky, and then land back in England to eat bacon and eggs in a quiet mess hall. The juxtaposition destroyed them. Every morning they would look around the breakfast table and see the empty chairs. A crew that had been laughing and joking the night before was simply gone. Their personal belongings were quietly packed away by ground staff before the surviving crews returned from debriefing. It was a ghostly erasure of life. The stress manifested physically. 20-year-old men developed the tremors of the elderly. They suffered from chronic insomnia, night terrors, and debilitating ulcers. But there was no escape. The Royal Air Force and RAF Command were ruthless about maintaining morale. If a pilot refused to fly, or if his nerve broke, he wasn't treated with compassion. He was labeled with the stamp LMF, lack of moral fiber. It was a mark of shame, branding him a coward, stripping him of his rank, and humiliating him before his peers. Trapped between the certain death of the 60-night rule and the social death of the LMF stamp, the Canadian crews did the only thing they could. They climbed back into the planes. They forced themselves to believe that they would be the lucky ones, the statistical anomalies who would beat the math. They did it not because they believed they would survive, but because the alternative, letting down the crewmates standing beside them, was unimaginable. But beyond the intense bond of brotherhood, there was a grim strategic reality that kept the Canadian crews flying. They understood something that history often overlooks. For years before a single boot stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the Bomber Command was the only Western front. It was the only way the Allies could strike directly at the heart of the Nazi war machine. The men of No. 6 Group knew that their sacrifice was part of a brutal calculus. Every rail yard destroyed in Essen meant fewer tanks moving to the front. Every ball bearing factory flattened in Schweinfurt meant fewer aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. And most importantly, every night they drew the German fighters and flak guns into the sky over Berlin meant those guns weren't pointing at the infantry preparing for the invasion of France. The logic was terrible but simple. If we don't fly, the boys on the ground will die. They were trading their lives in the air to buy survival for the soldiers who would eventually storm the beaches of D-Day. They were the battering ram, smashing themselves against the fortress of Europe so that others could eventually walk through the ruins. However, history forces us to ask the bitter question. Did Bomber Command win the war at an unacceptable cost? No other Allied campaign saw a higher casualty rate. The 60-night death sentence was not a myth. It was a statistical reality that decimated a generation. For a nation like Canada, with a population of only 11 million people at the time, the loss was staggering. Over 10,000 Canadian airmen were killed serving in the Bomber Command. These were not just numbers on a casualty list. They were the country's best and brightest. University students, young professionals, the future leaders of a nation, wiped out in the freezing skies over Germany. The tragedy is compounded by the silence that followed. For decades, the bomber crews were not celebrated like the fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain. The morality of area bombing, the destruction of entire cities, became a subject of intense debate. The men who survived the 60-night lottery returned home not to parades, but to a quiet, uneasy peace, carrying the physical and mental scars of what they had seen and what they had done. In the end, the story of the Canadian bomber crews is not just about the horror of war or the cold mathematics of survival. It is a story of an impossible duty accepted by the very young. They walked out to their planes night after night, watching the odds of survival drop toward zero, and they started the engines anyway. The 60-night death sentence was real. It was a contract signed in blood. And while the strategy remains controversial, the courage of the men who fulfilled that contract remains undeniable. They faced a mathematical certainty of death, and in doing so, they helped save the world.